Hi, I'm Walden Bello, and I'm here to tell you about the Gr8 Climate Sale. I'm here to tell you about how free trade, the corporations, and the governments of the G8 countries are standing in the way of real solutions to the climate crisis and to the problems of the peoples of the world. What is the Gr8 Climate Sale all about? It's all about how the big developed countries would like to escape their obligations of meeting the challenge of climate change, while at the same time their corporations, with the help of the World Trade Organization and the World Bank, can profit from this catastrophe. The climate crisis is no ordinary crisis. It is an emergency. Studies show that unless by 2020 we cut greenhouse gas emissions by at least 40% from their level in 1990, and unless we cut them by 80% by 2050, this world will be very different a few years from now from what it has been in the last generation.
Climate change is the heating up of the Earth's atmosphere through the release of powerful greenhouse gases as carbon dioxide and methane, primarily through burning fossil fuels, gas, oil and coal. We've been burning these fossil fuels for the last couple of hundred years, primarily in the richest countries in the world. That has increased the concentration, which means that we're warming up the Earth, and that warming is causing the climate patterns around the world to change. And the more we keep on burning, the more the Earth will warm and the more the climate will change. And some of the impacts include things like glaciers around the world, on which 1 billion people depend for their water supply. They could all melt if we do nothing to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases.
The evidence over the last few years has been pretty alarming, and the greenhouse effect was something that people were beginning to pay attention to as early as 1992. But many countries, particularly the United States and so on, were refusing to acknowledge the fact that climate change or global warming was a serious issue.
The climate emergency is basically that we've created a situation, mostly folks from the developed countries from the global north, have created a situation where we've used up the absorptive capacity of the atmosphere to take all of our greenhouse gas pollution. And so what's happening is we've basically made a situation where the planet is heating to a point where it's triggering changes in global patterns in the way we do agriculture and the way we experience storms, floods, droughts. So we're basically faced with an environment that we don't understand and we can't adapt to in ways we used to be able to adapt to.
Climate change is going to have devastating impacts. It already is having devastating impacts on communities all over the world, particularly in areas such as Africa, Southeast Asia and Latin America. The World Health Organization has pointed out that even now we're seeing 150,000 people die per year because with temperature increases, we're seeing that disease is becoming more widespread. We're also seeing very erratic weather conditions all over the world, and this is definitely being accelerated by climate change, and it's also making it much harder for communities to build resilience in order to adapt to climate change impacts.
I think for many people, climate change is a worry for the future. But I think there's a big myth around climate change, and I think that myth is that we're all somehow going to be affected together. So we're all in the same boat, we're all facing the same problems. We've seen, for example, in Burma, the impact there of the floods and the cyclone. So the threat that we perceive in the rich world, I think you have to multiply that by 100 to see what the real threat is to people in the south.
We can see that in environmental problems, there is really issues of rich and poor, for which they always have a better, more choice to avoid the environment degradation.
Climate change has serious impacts on forests, causing them to die back. As a consequence, forest-dependent communities, people living in the forests that rely on them, are losing their homes and their livelihoods.
The climate emergency really highlights to us just how much in peril a lot of peoples around the world, and I think especially of the conditions of a lot of indigenous peoples in the world, some of whose very existence is threatened by what we term the climate crisis. And I think particularly in Canada, communities in the far north who can experience up to 12 degrees of warming in this century, which would radically change their entire ecosystems, but also their very means of life and subsistence.
I think definitely exists the crisis. I think that in the last few years, most of the people have been talking about the climate change, but in the Arctic area. I think that we haven't talked really about the climate change crisis in the forest area, on the coast area, where other indigenous people also live. For example, where my people live, the Kuna people live, the coastal areas have been affected. The sea level is more higher than normal. Now the indigenous people need to go beyond the area they normally need to fish. So I definitely think that at this stage of the climate change crisis, all the indigenous people, whether they live on the forest area, whether they live on the coast and on the Arctic areas, have been affected negatively, losing their biodiversity, losing their traditional knowledge, even losing their economic, cultural and social development.
For Indigenous people globally, we are the people who have contributed least to creating climate change and the people who are on the front line of suffering the brunt of climate extremes. And I come from the Pacific region. In my region, we have 27 different nations. Up to 15 are at severe risk of becoming uninhabitable or not existing any longer by the end of the century.
The emergency we're facing is on one hand because we know now with scientific data that unless we take a drastic and radical action to stop our emissions, we're condemning the planet. We're basically driving ourselves to extinction. On the other hand, that if we do take action, we can save this planet and the future generations.
Now, what is the G8 or the Group of 8? Well, the G8 is an informal grouping of the big developed countries that includes Japan, the United States, Canada, Britain, Italy, France, Germany, and Russia. The Group of 8, once known as the Group of 7, it was mainly the big industrialized capitalist countries that formed this in the mid-70s. The G8 has served two purposes. One is to try to create some sort of a joint management of the economies of these big industrialized countries. But the G8 was also formed as a grouping to push the programs that the big powers of the West wanted on developing countries.
G8 policies affect not only people in G8 member states, but also people over the world.
The G8 was not constituted by any official body like the United Nations. We are really talking about an unelected body whose governments have taken on the task of determining policy for the rest of the world. And this is why most of the people of the world, especially from the South, do not see this body as legitimate at all.
The G8 countries who are historically responsible for climate change in terms of they're the ones over the last 200 years who have been responsible by far for the largest amount of carbon emissions. Now, instead of admitting that, the G8's now trying to shift the responsibility onto countries like India and China and playing this game whereby they're saying, well, we're not going to take substantive action on climate change until countries like China and India do something. This is clearly nonsense.
Well, we know that ever since the first G8 meetings back in the 1970s, even when they were still the G6, the main focus of their work was to try to get access to the oil resources and the energy resources of developing countries for the rich countries of the G8. That was the basic premise on which the G8 was set up. And indeed, we know that in 2005, when the G8 was here in the UK, in Scotland, even though they were talking about Africa and the world's poor, actually they admitted to us their main agenda was to try to keep up access to the oil and gas and other strategic natural resources of the developing world.
Not only should countries like the States and the UK be taking the lead in making very real, very serious emissions here and now, we should also be talking about a process of repaying the ecological debt that these countries owe to countries like India, whereby our process of industrialization and the material benefits that we enjoy in countries like the UK and US now is directly based on the environmental degradation that we've caused by these countries through resource extraction over the course of our colonial history.
While the G8 will talk about climate change and talk about its desire to do the right thing for the environment, actually their number one agenda is to maintain control of the world's natural resources, particularly the energy resources, so that they can be used for the corporations of the rich world.
If you take the G8 countries and their populations, they make up around 13% of the world's population, but they're responsible for 45% of current global emissions.
Well, we all know that historically the US is the biggest emitter that the humanity has ever known, and we also know that the US in the last few years under the Bush administration has refused to play ball with the international process. They've refused to support the Kyoto Protocol. They have refused to take decisive action at home. In fact, their coal use, for example, is increasing, their emissions are rising, and they're a good example of what happens when you only talk the talk and do not walk the walk on climate change.
It's quite clear that it's the rich world which is to blame for the climate crisis that we see at the moment. I don't think anybody's in any doubt over that. And yet, all they can do is try to come up with very weak targets to try and reduce their own emissions. Plus, they will never tackle the biggest emitters, the biggest polluters of the environment, which again are these great corporations.
The G8 has a very bad track record on climate. It's had numerous chances to invest in projects that would have brought renewable, clean energy to the world's poor, and it has chosen not to. The G8 has a very clear pattern of behaviour. If it gets backed into a corner, it gives money. What you'll see is that they will give more money to the World Bank, they'll create a fund. What they won't do is actually make strong commitments to the type of emission reductions that we need, the type of technology transfer need, the scale of funds that we need, and the changes to the way the global economy is run, which are fundamental to actually getting that emission reduction.
The World Bank has faced a crisis of legitimacy in recent years, in no small part because of the social movements around the world of people who've been rising up to challenge the fact that it's caused such poverty, that it's caused such environmental degradation through its policies and in supposedly addressing the issue of global poverty. And now, because of that crisis of legitimacy, the World Bank is rebranding itself as the institution that's going to save us from the problem of climate change.
All the investments, all the loans, all the policies driven by the World Bank contribute to the natural resources extractions, to the high emissions of greenhouse gases, and their solutions actually will give another burden to the planet, to the people.
More specifically, the World Bank announced a set of funds called the Climate Investment Fund. That's about $6 billion right now that's coming from the US, the UK, and Japan. And the idea of these funds is that the World Bank, again, is going to set the path for cutting emissions in the global south and for then helping people adapt to the inevitable consequences of climate change. When in reality, the World Bank is still the largest multilateral funder of fossil fuels in the world. So basically, we're asking folks in the global south to fund countries like my own, the United States, to keep on doing business as usual.
The framework that the World Bank's come up with is full of false solutions like carbon trading, carbon offsetting, nuclear power, carbon capture and storage. These things are not going to work. The only incontrovertible way of dealing with the threat of climate change is to leave the majority of fossil fuels in the ground. So the reason why they're coming up with these false solutions as opposed to doing the thing that really needs to be done is because it's directly opposed to the interests of the G8 in maintaining their position of economic superiority over the rest of the world.
So it's the G8 leaders that are pushing, in particular, World Bank carbon trading initiatives. And the agenda behind this is to expand carbon offsetting. So for forests, for example, the initiatives that are being piloted and that are receiving billions of dollars, principally from G8 countries, is basically a way that they can buy their way out of reducing their emissions, so that they can actually give a statistic of emissions reductions by, say, 2050, but that they won't actually be reducing global emissions because they'll just be buying up forests or expanding plantations or generating technology, which they call clean technology. But in fact, when you look into the details, it's clean coal, which is an oxymoron, it's biofuels, it's mega dams, it's all of the false solutions that civil society has been campaigning against is what the World Bank is pushing. And all the genuine solutions to climate change, such as clean renewable energy, solar energy, forest conservation that protects indigenous people's land rights, are being swept aside by these damaging new carbon trade initiatives.
Carbon trading means that, for example, if we are in the room, everybody's smoking, and some people are smoking cigars, and then people are not happy because of the emissions of the smoke in the rooms. And carbon trading means that some people will buy the rights of smoking. That's carbon trading. It allows rich people to pollute more.
Apart from northern countries and corporations, it's also the business elites, the corporate elites in southern countries who are benefiting enormously out of carbon trading. They're the ones who are receiving the vast majority of carbon financing. Quite often they're using the money they gain in order to expand their polluting industries, cause more problems in terms of climate change and in terms of adversely impacting those poorer communities that have to endure those factories and those offset projects.
Emission trading will not reduce emissions, because carbon trading will allow people to pollute more, will allow rich people to pollute more.
What the World Bank is doing is actually pioneering and creating new carbon markets. And those carbon markets are essentially the privatization of the Earth's carbon cycling capacity. And it's a privatization that's happening whereby the rights to the Earth's carbon cycling capacity are being given away for free to the biggest polluters. Carbon trading is supposed to be the most cost-effective way of making emissions reductions. That is, if it's cheaper to reduce your emissions over there rather than over here, it makes sense to do it over there when it's cheaper and then for me to buy those emissions reductions. That way the invisible hand of the market is meant to make sure that emissions reductions are made in the most cost-effective way as possible. But this obsession with cost-effectiveness is basically cost-effectiveness for companies in avoiding making genuine emissions reductions. What's the most cost-effective way isn't necessarily the best of way. And even on the grounds of cost-effectiveness, it's not cost-effective because it's creating more problems in the future, because it's going to be more difficult for us to make the transition to a low-carbon economy in northern countries. Carbon trading can be seen effectively as being carbon colonialism. That is, you're treating the ability of countries in the global south to make cheaper emissions reductions as a new commodity that can be extracted and exported to be profitably used to the benefit of northern companies, governments, and individual consumers.
Agrofuels and carbon trading is not the solutions. To produce agrofuels, you have to destroy a lot of forests. You have to change a lot of food productions area to feed cars, to feed power plants. It creates more food crisis, deforestation, impoverishment in all over the world, particularly in the southern and tropical countries.
It seems to us one of the most inhumane, disgraceful things that we in the rich world should be saying we need to have more access to drive our cars, we need to have more opportunity to burn up more fuels, and therefore we're going to be using biofuels, taking land out of production for food, for subsistence in the south, just so that we can have more access to a richer lifestyle here in places like the UK. That seems fundamentally wrong.
Even though now Indonesia is the largest palm oil plantation in the world, our government thinks is still not enough. They would like to add more lands for palm oil. But what happened now? Even in Indonesia, the price of cooking oil from the palm is increasing. So the Indonesian people cannot buy that oil anymore. For us, it's clear to say that it's more important to serve the cars in the North country to respond to the consumption of the peoples there compared to feed our own people in Indonesia.
So we know that the biofuels, as we have them at the moment, they're very bad for people's subsistence. They're not good environmentally because a lot of the time they're going to be, on balance, more damaging in terms of their carbon emissions.
The expansion of palm plantation is the main drivers of deforestation. Palm plantations destroyed and burned forests.
Biofuels, it's supposed to be seen as a panacea for fossil fuels substitution. But in many parts of our world, whether it's the palm oil producing countries or whether it's converting corn or maize, which is for food, being switched to biofuel to replenish the car. So basically people have to give up food and people have to go hungry to feed the car. Now this is totally irrational.
We have done work with our partners in countries like Colombia. We know that as a result of the increased demand for biofuels like palm oil, you have local communities who are being forced off their land, many times actually threatened by paramilitaries that they will lose their lives or their livelihoods if they stay in those farms. So there's a human cost and an environmental cost to biofuels.
Well, there are a few ways that trade and climate change are linked. I mean, first of all, free trade expands the global industrial system to live beyond its ecological limits. And then secondly, the rules of the World Trade Organization specifically prevent governments from being able to take measures to really manage their economies and take the measures to mitigate emissions of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. So you've got kind of a double whammy. You've got free trade policies that increase emissions, and then you've got free trade rules that prevent us from being able to take care of the problem.
The World Bank and the WTO and the governments that these organizations represent are pushing development as global growth. So that means that the way we produce food, industry, the way we do transportation, all of that is incredibly fossil fuel intensive. And these institutions say it has to be. That's the only way we're going to all become rich like the United States. The problem with that, of course, is that the United States has become rich off of extracting coal, oil, gas, fossil fuels that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions from developing countries for the past 200 years.
Well, we know that the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization, they've been behind this idea of increasing the amounts of trade which developing countries and developed countries should be engaged in. They've been pushing this neoliberal agenda, trade liberalization, open markets, and no restrictions on the type of trade there should be. So that has directly fueled the quantity of trade and directly fueled climate change and the greenhouse gas emissions which lead to climate change.
Trade already today is a major contributor to climate change. For example, 1/3 of global trade is in like products, so it amounts to things like chocolates from one country being exported to another, while cookies from that country is flown back to the other country. That sort of trade does not improve the lives of anybody, but it does cause real pollution. So trade already today is one of the drivers of climate change.
To give you an example from the UK, my country, we export hundreds of thousands of pork meat and lamb meat every year. And we import hundreds of thousands of tons of pork meat and lamb meat every year. We import and export exactly the same goods. And in trade terms, this is all good news because it means we're trading more, there's more commercial activity going on. But clearly it has no real purpose if we're sending out exactly the same things that we're taking in. All it does is it increases the amount of food miles, it increases the amount of distance that these things have to cover when they're coming in and out of the country, and therefore it adds on the most direct level to climate change.
Both free trade and carbon trade have had massive devastating impacts on communities in the global south and on their environment. And they're actually making the situation much worse for communities that are least responsible for climate change, such as indigenous peoples, fisherfolk, and peasant farmers.
So if the WTO and the World Bank suggest that more trade liberalization is going to solve the problem, that goes in flying in the face of what we have as the evidence here already.
How do trade rules prevent countries from coming up with effective solutions to the climate crisis? The trade-related intellectual property rights prevents countries from bringing in technology to be able to address the climate crisis without paying high rates of royalties to corporations in the north. If they don't pay these royalties, then they get penalized under the rules of the World Trade Organization.
The intellectual property rights regime which the WTO has brought in, the TRIPS agreement, is all about restricting access to technology. It's about privatizing the means of trying to cope with things like climate change. And countries from Africa and other parts of the global south have been crying out to get that technology so that they also can start addressing some of the issues around climate change and other environmental threats. Even though the rich countries signed up to a clause within the TRIPS agreement which said they should be transferring that technology to the south. They've failed to do that year after year, ever since the TRIPS agreement came into force over 10 years ago now.
I mean, one of the biggest measures that almost all governments are trying to take now to tackle climate change is energy efficiency. And they're creating new standards and stronger standards. Those standards are being looked at by the WTO as possible barriers to trade because they might discriminate against a particular exporter. And the exporter saying, oh, you didn't consult us on that standard, or that standard is too burdensome for us to meet. That's just one example of many measures that governments are right now under pressure to enact and to implement, and they have to look over their shoulder to see if they're breaking WTO rules or reducing the export competitiveness of some global corporation.
So what we're seeing is the impact impact of global trade is to both make climate change worse, but also it means that we can't cope with it as well. So unless we actually tackle the question of unfair trade, you won't be able to tackle the question of climate change.
Well, the G8 meeting is over and the results are as expected. A disaster for the climate and a disaster for the peoples of the world. Two things came out of this G8 meeting. First, the G8 countries declared that they would cut down greenhouse gas emissions globally by 50% by 2050. Well, this is too little, too late. The scientific community has already said that in order to prevent a spiral into uncontrolled climate change, you need at least an 80 to 90% cut of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The second distressing development, the G8 has endorsed the World Bank as the agency to which they would commit the very little money that they would have to assist developing countries to deal with climate change because the rich countries control the World Bank. So what are we to do? We cannot expect anything positive from the G8. If we are, in fact, to deal with the climate crisis effectively, we need a people's strategy, not a pro-corporate strategy such as that endorsed by the G8.
Well, I think climate change is the biggest challenge society faces today. But for that, we need to take action. And action to be taken means people will have to get out of their seats, get out of their comfortable lives and do something.
We consider the main problem here to be the power that capital has acquired over the world, the power that multinational corporations have managed to win over people. And for us, the first thing to do is to regain the power over these transnational corporations which have caused this problem. And that means an end to the free trade agenda, an end to the neoliberal investment agenda, and in its place, a people-centered and environment-centered alternative.
You know, there are these solutions out there and we are advocating for sustainable solutions, and we are opposed to corporate-driven agenda, which is the trading system, the financial system, the international system at this moment is driving an economic model which is basically anti-people and which is anti-environment. And the climate crisis is a phenomenon of that.
So what we want is a sustainable development for the planet, a fair distribution of resources, a fair distribution of opportunities, because we can get out of this problem, but for that we need everybody to work on the solution. And some countries will have to work harder because they're richer and because they're more responsible than others.
It's clear that what the rich countries of the G8 have to do is they have to take responsibility for the problem that they have caused. That means proper binding targets on everybody, not just little targets which we're hoping maybe to achieve in 40 years' time, but key binding targets on particularly the companies which are responsible for so many of the emissions that we have seen over the past 20 years.
I always explain it very easily. If everybody in the world would have the same way of life as we are living, for example, in the European Union, then we need between 3 and 4 planets more than have today.
We advocate what is called sustainable economies or sustainable society, where basically the essence of it is how can we conduct trade in a way that meets the needs of people? How can we foster sustainable agriculture, which is basically meeting people's food needs, which also puts agriculture in the hands of the poor instead of in the corporations, which basically means that you don't depend on fossil fuels, and how do you produce in a way that is environmentally sound and socially just? And there are solutions.
Education work is very important. We do a lot of educational campaigns on climate change, on the impacts, on the responsibilities of our governments, on our transnational companies, on our lifestyle. We have campaigns on reduction of energy consumption, on transport, to shift to public transport, to use the bicycle.
It's wonderful to see all the different ways that people are taking action on this issue in their local communities, starting community food groups or community growing schemes, and at the same time addressing the root causes of climate change and challenging the corporations and governments who are responsible, who are making these awful decisions, committing us to years of carbon emissions which are going to affect all our lives.
Also, there's very good campaigns to promote renewable energy like solar and wind energy, unfortunately are very controlled by transnational companies, especially of the electric and construction sectors. There's also a need to go back and see how in the 70s, when there was the last big energy crisis in countries like Denmark, for example, the people shift to promote a very local and very self-organized energy system and distribution system. We have to go back to these kind of renewable energy systems and not these huge renewable energy packages which are controlled by transnational companies.
Well, first we want it to be recognized that indigenous peoples around the world are going to be the most affected by climate change. And recognizing also that indigenous peoples have contributed least to climate change, but also have some of the most to contribute in terms of solutions. We're also calling for indigenous peoples to be part of what are actual climate change solutions and contribute their traditional knowledge to the rest of the world. We're also calling for indigenous peoples to be supported because they'll face some of the most extreme challenges in adapting to climate change.
The solution that we see is ban the deforestation. If we maintain the forest as this level, we could provide a benefit for all the populations around the world, not just for indigenous peoples.
So to radically reduce emissions, it has to be underpinned by a reduction in consumption. And it also demands a paradigm shift away from the current neoliberal model that promotes unsustainable consumption and production. It would also entail massive investment into clean renewable energy using the sun and the wind and tidal power, and also an expansion of sustainable transport options.
We see climate change and the climate crisis as a global justice issue. We see it as something which has been visited upon the global South by the rich world, and therefore it's another form of the imperialist adventure.
Climate justice means not going for techno fixes like nuclear power, biofuels, but instead ensuring food sovereignty. What this means is living up to the principle of common and differentiated responsibility, which says that although it is the responsibility of everybody to combat climate change, those who contributed most of the problem should make the most adjustment. This means that the G8 and other developed countries should be the ones that undertake the greatest adjustment, the greatest reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions, while at the same time developing countries also do their share.
When we're talking about climate justice, what we mean is that we want a real, effective solution to climate change, but we want to make sure that it's one that's fair. People living in coastal communities, for example, people who can't afford to buy food, where the price is increasingly high. They're also the people that are likely to suffer from a lot of the solutions that are being proposed. And this just is not fair, because we think that the way that the climate change negotiations have been dealt with so far is inequitable.
So as activists here in the UK, we have to pressure our government, we have to demand that our government doesn't support new damaging developments, things like new coal-fired power stations here in the UK, new airport runways, massive new road building projects. As activists, we have to challenge this, and we have to say, in the name of climate justice, you must stop doing this, and you must implement policies which are really about creating a better, a fairer, a more environmentally sustainable world.
Now that you know all about the Gr8 Climate Sale, shouldn't you do something about it? Well, you can do a number of things. You can learn more about climate change. You can go and educate people about it. You can begin to change your lifestyle. But most important, you can participate politically in reversing global warming. What this means is going out into the streets, participating in demonstrations, but most important, being part of the great global process that will end up in COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009, when delegates from all over the world will be meeting to determine the fate of the world. So let's go out there, take action, and fight for climate justice now.